Every time you take a bite of food, you are harnessing the incredible power of metabolism to power your cells' energy, build new cells, change chemical pathways within your body. But here's the issue with metabolism. In the United States, about 90% of adults have at least some degree of metabolic dysfunction. Now, that's a big problem because metabolic health directly relates to brain health, heart health, longevity, and so much more. So, where are things going wrong, and what can we do to help to right the ship? I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and in this video, we'll be exploring the incredible science of metabolism. We'll be getting into the key reasons why metabolic health has become problematic in the United States and around the world, and the simple strategies that we all need to avail ourselves of in order to help to reclaim better metabolic health. Let's jump right into this video. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Today we are doing a Big Bold Health webinar all about metabolic health. Now, you may have heard about metabolic health from one place, podcast, book, or who knows what. It is an incredibly popular topic right now. It is something that I feel everyone is engaging with as it relates to understanding their wellness. And metabolic health absolutely relates to everything that has to do with our energy levels, our mitochondrial health, how we think, how we act, how we feel. Every aspect of our wellness is tethered to metabolism because metabolism is basically how our bodies are able to gain and process energy. Now, quick disclaimer before we jump into the science. I am not your physician. The statements that I make here are not intended to take the place of you getting medical advice. It should not be seen as medical advice, and you should follow up with your healthcare practitioner and not take the information from this lecture as health advice. So, let's talk about what we're going to cover in this lecture. We're going to talk about what metabolism is. We're going to talk about why it matters. We're going to talk about the key tenets of human metabolism because metabolism is a multi-species, multi-organism type process. We're most interested in what happens in our bodies. We're going to focus in on diet. So how does the food that we eat influence our metabolic health? And we're going to talk about the immune metabolic connection, something called immunometabolism, an emerging field of research that connects this incredibly large domain of immunology with metabolism. And then we're going to talk about some studies that have just come out in the last year or so that explore where the research is going with metabolism and some practical breakthroughs that may help to really improve metabolic monitoring for lots of people. So make sure you stay tuned to the very end because there's some crazy technology coming out, things that look at, for example, what is in your eye to be able to tell you about your metabolic health, contact lenses, all sorts of stuff. So that's where we'll wrap things up. And again, if you have questions, comments, if you're watching this after the fact, you can drop them into the comment section. If you're watching this live, put them in the Q&A section. I'll try to get to them at the end. So we have to do the basic definitions to understand what metabolism actually is. Like anything in medicine or in science, it's easy to gloss these things over, and then I think it's much easier to make this into something it is not. So what metabolism is technically all of the chemical reactions that sustain life. And like I alluded to before, metabolism is not unique to humans. Everything that's alive has some version of a metabolic system. If you want to put this into a slightly more understandable, pragmatic format for what it means for us, it's the way that our bodies use food for energy, for building, and for repair. It's also the removal of the waste that comes from that energy consumption and use. So it's everything around how the food that we bring in is going to be converted into energy, building blocks, and then what we do with the result of that process. There are two big components of metabolism, kind of on the teeter-totter. They're the opposing ends. There's anabolism, which is the building up, and then catabolism, which is the breaking down. So anabolic metabolism is talking about building muscle. You may have heard of anabolic steroids. Anabolism is basically anything that builds versus catabolism, which is anything that breaks down. So digestion, cellular respiration, things that break down and are going to be opposed to things that build up. So, some important considerations as we dive into this topic of metabolism is that metabolism does many things, but a central role and something for us to really consider as key to this conversation is that metabolism generates adenosine triphosphate or ATP, and ATP is the primary energy currency of our body. Without ATP, we shut down, and we shut down incredibly quickly. This is why, for example, if you were going to clip the arteries going to the brain, a person would lose consciousness very quickly, and then they would wind up dying very quickly after that. It's because our tissues need energy. In order to produce that energy, they need oxygen, they need glucose, they need fuel, but ATP is the central currency of the body. To optimize for wellness, we need to have efficiency, balance, and adaptability of our metabolic state. We're going to talk a little bit about metabolic flexibility and why that's emerging as a popular concept right now. But the bottom line here is not to say that you want your metabolism to be running at a super high level, or to say you want it running really slow, or really anything in between. What you want is a resilient metabolic state that allows you to respond to the demands on your body and that allows you to effectively translate energy into currency for your cells, build the things that you need to build, and break down the things that you need to break down. So, where does metabolism happen in the body? The key organelle of metabolic state is going to be mitochondria. A mitochondrion is thought to be kind of an ancient bacterium that was introduced to one of our ancient cells, and they formed this commensal partnership or this mutualistic relationship where they both benefited each other. So we got energy from the mitochondria. We actually got a lot of things from the mitochondria, but we got energy from the mitochondria, and the mitochondria got a safe place to live and a bunch of nutrients from us. And so our bodies are loaded with mitochondria. They're found in almost every tissue in our cells or in our bodies, with the exclusion here of red blood cells, which actually don't produce energy. But mitochondria are located throughout the body. We have so many of them throughout our system, and their relative state is now believed to be a central driver of how our metabolic health is. The liver is maybe the most important metabolic organ in that it is the kind of overseer of metabolic processes. So, how we process nutrients, how we build things up. So, for example, building up glycogen from glucose or breaking glycogen down into glucose and converting things in between different forms of storage and energy formats. It's also key to detoxification. So, the liver is, if we are going to probably take a quiz and we're going to say, what is the key organ for metabolism? It would be the liver. But we also know that muscle tissue, which can be a huge percentage of our overall muscle mass or our overall mass of our bodies, is a major contributor to systemic metabolism. Why is that? So muscle is the major consumer of glucose. When you exercise, your muscles bring in a whole lot more glucose. And so after we eat a meal, muscle is the primary uptake of that glucose from our bloodstream. Muscle isn't just a glucose sink, meaning it doesn't just suck up glucose from our bloodstream. It also consumes fatty acids, it produces metabolic molecules, and it regulates systemic metabolism. And this is a big transition in how we see muscle. Historically, we've thought about muscle as obviously important to allowing us to move and to allowing us to have strength, and more recently in understanding how much glucose or blood sugar muscle is able to extract from our circulation. But now we know that muscle produces molecules called myokines that regulate metabolism throughout the body. Two other key organ systems that are going to regulate metabolism are going to be adipose tissue. So fat tissue, which even more so than muscle, can dramatically change in terms of the total percentage of our bodies. There's no tissue that has the possibility of becoming such a large percentage of our bodies as adipose tissue. And adipose tissue, which is basically just a scientific term for fat tissue, is so much more than just storage. Fat tissue is where a ton of metabolic health is either won or lost. And we know that fat tissue releases a host of molecules that regulates metabolism throughout the body. We also know that the gut is key to metabolism for a number of reasons, but the most important being this is where nutrient absorption occurs. It's also where the microbiome is primarily located, and the microbiome can actually change the way that we absorb nutrients. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't in any way the entire spectrum of where metabolism happens. It happens in the kidneys, it happens in the brain. The brain regulates systemic metabolism based on how it changes the way that we act. But these are just some of the major domains in which, in terms of the total weight, in terms of the total mass, so much of metabolism is happening. Now, I understand we're going to be covering a lot of material here. Some of this stuff is things that you've probably heard of before, maybe stuff that you already know, especially if you're a physician or a researcher, but we're going to be building here into the most recent research. So Stay with me if this seems a little bit basic. We're going to get into some more nuanced stuff. And if this already feels a little bit overwhelming to you, a reminder, obviously you can watch this again. We'll be sending it out. And if you're watching this on YouTube or some other platform, you can watch it at whatever speed works for you. So what we're going to be talking about as it relates to metabolism is the couple of key processes and how they can be altered by our diet. So kind of here are the major processes to know about. There are a number of processes for metabolism in the body, and if you've ever learned the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, you know that this is a complex system with multiple intermediaries and steps in the chain. But the ones to know about are that carbohydrates, when consumed by us, when we eat foods that contain carbohydrates, are metabolized into glucose. And glucose is converted into ATP by way of glycolysis, lysis, breakdown of glucose, and the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle. Then we have fats. Now, people usually talk about fats as though they're all one thing, but the reality is that fats are kind of structured into different types of chain lengths and different types of kind of backbone that they're attached to. So a triglyceride or a triacylglycerol is going to be basically three fatty acids connected to a backbone, but you may also have a free fatty acid that is not connected to a backbone. So fats in general, when we eat them from our food, are converted down to eventually fatty acids. Fatty acids can then be oxidized and they can enter the TCA cycle. And so that means that fats can be converted into ATP, but fats can also be signaling molecules. For example, we know that omega-3 fats, as opposed to trans fats, can actually have immune signals and metabolic signals throughout our bodies. So fats are more than just fuel, they're actually signaling molecules. Proteins, maybe even more significantly. So, yes, we can convert proteins into energy, but proteins also, by way of getting converted into peptides and amino acids, are major constituents for signaling pathways and are building blocks for our bodies. Proteins are kind of the core scaffold on which most of our bodies are built. And so when we eat protein, it is broken down into amino acids. Those amino acids translate into energy, to building blocks, and also to signaling. Lastly, here in terms of pathways, so the TCA or the Krebs cycle, and I promise I won't test you on this because it is a complicated process. When we were in biochemistry and we had to memorize this, and again in medical school, it was always one of these things that people dreaded because it is so complicated. But the TCA cycle is kind of this intermediary between the breakdown of glucose and the conversion of the glucose byproducts into the electron transport chain to actually make the ATP, the majority of the ATP. So when we eat food or when we have energy in our bodies in the form of food molecules, it goes through these steps and kind of the final processes of these steps when we're doing the standard most energy generating process for ATP is going through this Krebs cycle or TCA cycle, and then eventually going into the electron transport chain to undergo oxidative phosphorylation to produce ATP. Okay, that is a lot of background science. I forgive, or please forgive me if you're saying that's more than I wanted. Tell me about what foods to eat. Tell me about diabetes, something that's more relevant. But this is the cornerstone of understanding metabolism, is basically the idea that the food that we eat goes through these different processes and that gets converted into energy, into building blocks, and into signals that influence our physiology. One other concept I want to talk about here is metabolic flexibility. You may have heard of metabolic flexibility, especially if you're in the keto or the paleo space. The idea here is that we should be able to switch between different fuel sources depending on the need and the availability of the food. What I'm saying by that is our bodies can run on multiple forms of fuel, but not everybody's body is set up to make that effective or efficient. And so metabolic flexibility is kind of the idea that we should be able to manage with multiple fuel sources. But unfortunately, for many of us, much of the time, we've kind of been set up in a way that we're not capable of doing that in the healthiest way possible. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And again, I'll just put the disclaimer here. In no way is this the full comprehensive set of metabolic reactions in our body. So something that's a bit more relevant maybe to most of you in talking about how does our food influence our metabolism is the specific pathways by which food actually gets converted into metabolic state. So firstly, food turns into fuel for our cells. Unlike plants, for example, we really need to be consuming food calories in order to have the energy for our cells. So if you don't eat, you will die. And the reason for that is, I guess, several reasons. But the main one is that you need to get the ATP that is locked up in the bonds between the food, the calories that we consume. But beyond just being the energy itself, food directs our metabolic state. So food contains molecules that actually can push our metabolic state one way or another. And this is one of the reasons why, despite the fact that it is true that, calories in versus calories out matters from kind of a thermodynamic perspective, meaning if you don't consume enough calories, yeah, you'll die. And if you consume too many calories, there's a higher chance of gaining weight. But food actually contains tons of signals that influence the way that those calories are used. And so that's important because when we understand that there are differences in different foods, so for example, eating a bunch of fiber is different from eating a bunch of added sugar, even though they're both carbohydrate, we can start to customize our diets towards what actually optimizes metabolic health and go hopefully a couple of steps beyond this idea that a calorie is a calorie. So macronutrient balance, this is the first step beyond just calories, is to understand that carbs, fats, and proteins differentially influence metabolic pathways. For example, insulin release. So, insulin is produced by our bodies, by the pancreas, in response to certain signals. So, one of those signals is going to be in response to a high carbohydrate meal or added sugar. But if you were to consume fat or proteins, even if it was the exact same amount of calories, you would not produce as much insulin. Similarly, mitochondrial activity is differentially influenced by the foods that we eat. And relevant to what we're doing at Big Bold Health, we know that the immune system is differentially affected by the mechanisms that come from certain fats, carbs, and proteins. I'll bring up this example again. Consuming equal amounts of trans fats versus omega-3 fats, even though they may have the exact same caloric impact, has very differential effects on the immune system. We also know that micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals, factor into metabolism by acting as cofactors for metabolic reactions. So, if we want to keep our metabolic state healthy, we need to have the necessary kind of adjuncts or assistants to the chemical reactions that allow us to extract energy from our food. And those assistants are going to be these vitamins and minerals, especially things like B vitamins, magnesium, and zinc. So the point here I made, but I'll make again, is calories matter, but the makeup of our food matters a whole lot too. And one point that is worthy of really nailing home is that if you were to eat the exact same amount of calories, the exact same meal, well, whether it was ultra processed or minimally processed meal, you might be able to say that everything looks the same in terms of the caloric makeup, even the fats, carbs, and proteins. But the impact of that food, because of all the additional data that it contains on our metabolism, can be absolutely night and day, polar opposite. So, how is our metabolic health today? Now, I'm not going to poll you as the audience, but I hope that you have probably had a sense that it is not good because multiple studies just in the last few years have examined this. And what they found, this was the first study that was published, I think 2019, is that roughly 12.2% of American adults had optimal metabolic health. And this was followed by a study that came out in 2022 looking at basically health in American adults. And it concluded here that basically less than 10% of American adults have optimal metabolic health. So that sounds concerning. Why does it matter? Metabolic health translates into mental health, lifespan, cognitive health, gut health, functional status, and so much more. So, this is an issue that affects us all. And by optimizing metabolic health, we're able to act on these different pathways. So, let's talk about where things are going wrong and where they can go right. What are the things that happen in the modern world that promote metabolic dysfunction? Obviously, the food that we eat, but we're also very sedentary. And you can't exercise your way to weight loss if you don't change your diet. But exercise dramatically influences metabolic state. We also know that there are metabolism disruptors in products that we use, in the air that we breathe, and that chronic stress and poor sleep contribute to metabolic dysfunction. So let's go through each of these for a moment. Ultra processed foods and access to healthy food. Our food is rich in calories but low in key nutrients. 70+% of foods in the American food system, and depending on where you're tuning in from around the world, you can probably find these statistics for where you live, but the American food system has roughly 70% of foods and beverages with added sugars. Added sugars, especially in liquid form, are probably one of the most strong contributors to metabolic dysfunction. And what we're saying here is that most foods, most beverages contain added sweeteners in the United States. When we look at the way we've set up the American healthcare system, or I should say the American food system, we recognize that we are actively subsidizing metabolic dysfunction. We are subsidizing, for example, the production of high fructose corn syrup. Now, there is some conversation right now as to how bad is high fructose corn syrup and is sucrose or standard sugar better? Well, depending on who you ask, and I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman recently, Robert Lustig, who feels very strongly that fructose, which is one of the two sugars, glucose and fructose in sucrose, is a bigger contributor to metabolic dysfunction than is sucrose. But when we're talking here about this 5% difference between high fructose corn syrup and sucrose, not a huge deal. What is a big deal is that we are actively subsidizing the production of high fructose corn syrup, and therefore we have more of this in the market at a cheaper cost, and this is absolutely a metabolic disruptor. We also see, and a huge problem I would say, is that we're marketing the most metabolically unhealthy foods to the youngest people. So look in the grocery store at the cereals that are marketed to kids, and then look at the ingredient list. It is absolutely so far away from what is a metabolically healthy meal. So there are some major issues in the American system that absolutely translate over into other countries as it relates to why our food is so metabolically destructive. Now, sedentary behavior, I'm probably not going to tell you anything that you don't know here, but when you think about the overall number of Americans who meet the guidelines for aerobic plus resistance training, it's roughly 24%. And the actual number of people who are getting enough exercise is probably a little bit lower than there because even these guidelines are maybe a little bit lenient. What we see is, again, no surprises here, we are spending more and more of our time seated and sedentary. And why that matters is because it's not just about the weight. When we exercise, when we use our muscles, as I just described a little bit earlier, we produce molecules called myokines that regulate metabolism. We suck up glucose from our bloodstream. So if we're not using our muscles, this is a significant contributor to metabolic dysfunction. We also know that our modern world, because of all the chemicals in our environment, is increasingly going to predispose us to metabolic risk. So you probably heard of bisphenol A or BPA as a metabolic disruptor. There are also phthalates. There are also PFAS and other molecules found in our water supply, found on certain products. The relative contribution of these environmental chemicals on our metabolic dysfunction may not be anywhere near as significant as decades of eating unhealthy food and not moving, but it is clear, mostly based on preclinical research, that these molecules in our food supply and in our water supply and in our exposure are not doing our metabolic health any favors. And so some of what we've seen here, again, kind of more preclinical research, is that these metabolic disruptors appear to influence products like, or influence molecules like estrogen, influence the microbiome, change the relative makeup of the immune system, especially in our fat tissue, and then may actually alter certain metrics related to metabolic health, like blood pressure and cholesterol. And so some of these studies, which I can link to if you need to get those, I think you will have the slides afterwards, which have just been published in the last years, start to increasingly draw these connections between environmental exposures and metabolic dysfunction. In addition to this, we know that our exposure to air pollution is associated with metabolic dysfunction. So, a domain that I'm spending more and more time researching is how our air quality influences our health. Now, I learned in medical school and in residency that air pollution is a problem because it correlates with exacerbations of respiratory conditions, asthma, COPD. We're now understanding, though, that air pollution, because these molecules in our air, our PMs, particulate matter, are so small and can get into our bloodstream, can have a dramatic impact on immune and metabolic pathways. And so there are studies like this one, many studies actually, showing correlations between air pollution exposure and metabolic dysfunction. So the actual air that we breathe here is a contributor to metabolic dysfunction. Chronic stress, you probably heard this one before, but chronic stress promotes metabolic dysfunction. How does this happen for those who are interested in a little bit of the nerdiness? So, chronic stress leads to activation of two principal pathways in our bodies. One is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and we have specifically a molecule we talk about here, which is called cortisol. So cortisol production being revved up is going to lead to insulin resistance and higher glucose. But the other pathway here is going to be sympathetic activation, where you have higher levels of norepinephrine or noradrenaline and epinephrine or adrenaline. Both of these molecules promote the breakdown of glycogen and promote the production of glucose. So chronic stress here leads to metabolic dysfunction directly through these two pathways, and long-term exposure to chronic stress has been significantly associated with higher risk for developing metabolic issues. Sleep, I can talk for hours about the importance of sleep, but sleep directly translates into metabolic health. Getting good sleep translates into better metabolic health, and conversely, having conditions like obstructive sleep apnea, which is translating into worse sleep, correlates with higher rates of metabolic dysfunction. And maybe most importantly here, getting better sleep translates to better metabolic state. So this isn't just an incidental association. Sleep actually is a principal driver of metabolic state. Okay, so now we're going to transition into talking about diet, and we're going to talk about how diet influences metabolic health, and we're going to talk about certain patterns of diet that have strong associations with metabolic state. So let's talk about a couple of examples of metabolic state and diet. Now, I know, and if you're interested and you're watching live, drop it into the chat function, what diets you've heard about that are promising, that you're going to have tons of weight loss or improvements in metabolic health. Because my take here has been that every diet is pretty much being geared towards telling you it's going to fix your metabolic health. The reason being is because the main reason people adopt a diet is for weight loss, and weight loss is not the major thing that tells you about metabolic health, but it is a function of metabolic state. So again, there are lots of diets, lots of different claims. Here's just a couple examples of what we know. The Mediterranean diet, which we can define, it's kind of variably defined, but is generally rich in healthy fats, fibers, polyphenols, is linked to improvements in metabolic function in people with pre-existing metabolic dysfunction, and it's linked to protective effects against metabolic dysfunction being developed. The Western diet, or the standard American diet, or the ultra processed diet, or any other terminology you want to use for what most people are now eating, is a diet high in carbs, sugars, and processed fats. And I should say here, carbs and added sugars. So carbs here, we're worried about refined carbohydrates. So these are carbs where the fiber has been stripped away. These are carbs that have been bleached and otherwise processed in such a way that they break down into sugar very quickly. In addition to the added sugar and sweeteners I mentioned and processed fats, these are ingredients in diet that are associated with metabolic dysfunction, fatty liver, chronic inflammation, which is actually a piece of what metabolic dysfunction looks like. And then the ketogenic diet, which has gained popularity in the last couple of years. It's started around the 1930s for epilepsy, but now is being looked at as a metabolically healthy diet. The good thing about the ketogenic diet is it is low in processed carbohydrates and ultra processed foods, usually if you do it the right way, and low in added sugars. And it has been associated with significant improvement in metabolism in people who have pre-existing type 2 diabetes. With that said, and we'll talk about in a moment, a couple of caveats to this. One being that we don't have good long-term data on whether the ketogenic diet is a good plan for people's overall health. And one of the liabilities to this is it tends to be low in things like polyphenols and fiber, which are independently associated with better metabolic health. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how diet influences our metabolism. I discussed a couple of these pathways, but here's, I think, a good synthesis of what we know. Diet quality over time strongly correlates with metabolic health. Now, I know it's tempting to say that you're going to eat this one meal or you're going to do this juice cleanse and it's going to fix everything. You're going to drop 20 pounds over a weekend if you do this celery juice cleanse. That's really not the way that this works. And if it did, I would be incredibly concerned because there's no physical way a person can lose 20 pounds in a weekend unless they're getting an amputation. What we do know is that diet quality over time is maybe the strongest correlation with metabolic health, meaning a person's overall dietary quality strongly correlates with their metabolic health. If we improve our diet, it can actually reverse certain metabolic issues. And so if you look at the spectrum of things that are related to metabolic dysfunction, probably type 2 diabetes is the best example. Type 2 diabetes affects about 10% of Americans, and pre-diabetes, which is basically metabolic dysfunction that just hasn't quite reached the level as being diagnosed as diabetes, is still metabolic dysfunction and is affecting about 39% of American adults. So between pre and actual diabetes, we have roughly 50% of American adults now. And research is showing that if we change our diet, we can decrease our needs for these diabetes medications, and in some cases, even reverse the diabetes altogether. So this is a great example here of how dietary modification is so powerful for metabolic state. Excess calories, even though that's not the only variable, does induce metabolic strain. So if you're eating day in and day out, eating at night, eating throughout all the hours of the day, and consuming more calories than you need, it does contribute to metabolic strain and may impair metabolic flexibility. Some interesting correlates here. Protein actually uses up around 20 to 30% of calories as we digest it versus 5 to 10% for fat and about 0 to 3% for carbohydrates. So basically what we're saying here is there's an effect of different forms of macronutrients on how our bodies kind of pull energy from them. So this is called the thermic effect of protein. It's an interesting thing to just check out if you're interested in metabolism. Just kind of cool to know that to digest protein, it actually uses up more energy than for fats and for carbs. Uh, One of the basic correlations here that many people are familiar with is that if you eat certain foods, it changes your glucose in real time. So this is one of the reasons why CGMs or continuous glucose monitors have been popularized, is because it gives us a sense in real time as to what our food is doing to our metabolism. Micronutrients, as I already mentioned, so things like vitamins and minerals influence how we produce, the quality of the amount we're able to produce, and the actual amount we're able to produce of energy throughout our bodies. And very interesting stuff here is that our microbiome state changes how much energy we extract from food. I'm going to say that again. The makeup of your gut microbiome changes how much energy you extract from that food. So this is why talking about microbiome health is so much more than just saying, oh, I'm having cramps and I'm no longer having cramps. It's actually changing how your metabolism works. Ultra processed foods, I've been asked many times recently to kind of be explicit about what I mean when I talk about ultra processed foods. There are several groups, including the World Health Organization, the United States government, and others that are creating new criteria for what an ultra processed food is. Most of the time, we're looking at the NOVA criteria. So, what we're talking about here, foods made of substances extracted from foods, derived from food constituents, or synthesized in laboratories. Some examples of what this actually includes would be flavor enhancers, colors, emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, preservatives, and maybe most importantly, these are foods designed to be super palatable, convenient, and appealing through additives and processing techniques. How do you know if a food is an ultra processed food? Well, if you look at the back of the ingredient list and you start seeing a whole lot of ingredients, that is a signal that it may be an ultra processed food. If it contains added sugar, that is a signal it may be an ultra processed food. Are certain foods that are highly processed still nutritious and still maybe good options? I think the answer is yes. So, in the hospital setting, working with especially older people or post-surgical people who, maybe don't have the ability to eat a whole bunch of healthy meals each day, either because, they're infirmed from a recent procedure, or sometimes because they have poor dentition, or for reasons related to economics, you're not always going to be able to get access to pure, healthy, minimally processed foods. And sometimes, for example, a protein meal replacement shake is the best option. But I would caution, there's still better options. So you don't need a ton of added sugar in that beverage. And so, not to throw any brands under the bus, but if you go to your typical store and buy a meal replacement shake, you will be shocked by how many additional flavors and sugars and other junk is in that. Okay, moving forward. Ultra processed food is a concern because it is linked to higher risk for blood sugar dysfunction. That is a really good surrogate for metabolic dysfunction. It is linked to unhealthy lipid measurements. So here we're talking about things like triglycerides, and it is linked to much higher rates of obesity. And I'll say this note of caution again, which is obesity and overweight and talking about fat or weight in no way is the be all end all to determine whether a person is metabolically healthy. However, it can be a proxy for the determination of whether there is a signal that your metabolic state is not optimized. So, just because a person is overweight does not mean they are metabolically unhealthy, but it does give us some indication here, especially if we're using better tools than BMI and actually looking at fat mass. It can give us a signal that problems may be at a higher level of potential risk. And we know that diet, specifically ultra processed food, is strongly correlated with weight gain and especially unhealthy weight gain. So talking about, I would say my my biggest concern as it relates to cutting one thing out from diet is going to be added sugars and to some extent refined carbohydrates. So you can make an argument for a lot of other things. You can say, well, we need some amount of X, Y, or Z. Most people do not need added sugar. This isn't something where the body is, struggling to have enough glucose, and unless you have that candy bar or that sweetened fruit juice, you're going to have a problem. But we have largely conditioned ourselves to believe that we have these sugar crashes, which even if we are having a sugar crash, it doesn't mean that the solution is to just pump in a whole bunch of added sugar. Maybe it's a function of the fact that we've actually had so much added sugar that we've trained our body to have these high and low blood sugars. So for most people, and I'll caution here most people, because for example, if you have diabetes and you need to have access to something sweet in case your blood sugar crashes, totally understand. But the body doesn't really need added sugar in terms of maintaining healthy metabolism. Added sugar is empty calories, textbook example. And in the United States, children, adults, and adolescents are consuming about 67 pounds of added sugar a year. Again, I'm talking about this as it's unnecessary. You could make the argument, well, I want to be able to have some sugar on occasion to enjoy a dessert, fine, but don't necessarily assume that because you're consuming that, it's something that your body needs. And what we know right now is that roughly 63% of children and about 50% of adults are drinking sugary beverages each day. Sugary beverages, sugar sweetened beverages are probably the single worst food for metabolic health because they have everything that we don't want and nothing we want. There's no fiber, there's no value in terms of nutrients. What you're getting is just a big dose of sugar that gets immediately absorbed and gets increased in terms of your systemic or your circulating blood sugar. And sugar sweetened beverages in particular have been strongly correlated with metabolic dysfunction. I mentioned before, but it's a good statistic to be aware of. 70% of the foods and beverages in the American system contain added sweeteners. And refined carbohydrates, and again, what we're talking about here is taking grain products in particular, stripping away the fiber, stripping away a lot of the nutrients found in that grain, and making them as kind of bland as possible. Refined carbohydrates also spike blood sugar and are linked to worse metabolic health. And the reason for that is when you eat that cake or cookie or piece of bread or rice treat, any sort of pastry, your body is able to break those bonds of the carbohydrate very quickly. And what you get is basically this incredible surge of sugar in the food. And you can look at what this represents in terms of the glycemic index or glycemic load of a food that you consume. So just real quick, bringing in a study to kind of prove my point. Added sugar is associated with weight gain and risk of developing obesity over 30 years. This is a study that basically showed that the more added sugar you consume, the more your risk is for gaining weight and becoming obese. You don't usually get these types of linear associations. I don't think anyone's really pushing back against this. Added sugar contributes dramatically to weight gain and metabolic dysfunction. We'll talk in a moment about what to do about this because the reality is, unless you make some pretty significant changes, you're going to be eating a lot of added sugar. Okay, what do we do to improve metabolic wellness? First thing I'll say is I'm not the guy who's going to tell you, I've solved for this. Here's the pill. Here's the diet. It's going to be perfect. The reality is that when we exist in the modern world, unless you're planning to go off grid and grow your own food and raise your own cattle, if you're interacting with this modern world, you're going to be experiencing these exposures. You're sometimes going to be in an airport and have to eat some junk food. You're sometimes not going to get great sleep. You're going to be stressed. So the goal here is simply to improve rather than to say, got it locked, everything's fixed, my metabolic state is perfect. This is a process rather than an instant solution. So what can we do about this? Let's go through each of these sequentially. Talking about diet. What does a diet for better metabolic health look like? These are the key tenets. We're going to talk about how to improve blood sugar, promote gut health, improve immunometabolism, create metabolic flexibility, improve hormone signaling, and promote healthy muscle. But before we get into that real quick, what is immunometabolism? If any of you are out there and have been to my lectures in San Diego or any of the other places that I've been in the last year, you will know that I've been lecturing on immunometabolism. And this is a topic that connects the dots between metabolic state and immune state. And this is probably the single most powerful way to conceptualize how lifestyle maps onto our health. So let's get into some of these specifics. What do you do to improve blood sugar control and metabolic flexibility? Now, again, caveat, disclaimer, if you have pre-existing blood sugar issues, that's where you want to be working with your doctor. I have worked with patients who have very brittle diabetes, whose blood sugars go up to 300s, 400s, and then crash down to 50. And if you're one of these people, you really don't want to be getting your advice from me or anyone online. You really want to be working with a practitioner. But generally speaking, what are the things that correlate with better blood sugar control? More whole grains and fiber. I know what some of you are going to say. Oh, I thought grains were bad for us. Oh, I thought we shouldn't be. Okay, I hear what you're saying. And this is what the data would suggest, is that the consumption of more fiber-rich whole grains is correlated with better metabolic health. Caveat here, I am not saying that you should go out and buy a loaf of white bread and say, well, I'm eating more wheat. That's what Dr. Austin Perlmutter said. In no way is that what I'm suggesting. What I'm saying here is to diversify your intake of minimally processed carbohydrates that are rich in fiber. And so here what we're talking about is what I would tend to do more of, not necessarily grains, but pseudo grains. So buckwheat, quinoa, things that actually can provide a lot of these nutrients, but don't necessarily spike your blood sugar as much as a refined grain. Nuts and seeds, excellent here. So for a number of reasons, polyphenols, micronutrients, fiber, these are great ways, and they have been correlated with better metabolic health, but great ways to make snacks a good part of your metabolic state. Berries, leafy greens, healthy fats. Let's talk about a little bit of the more contentious stuff. So red meat. I'm sure there are those in the audience watching this who would say, oh, well, if I want to be metabolically healthy, I should just be a carnivore because then I'm not eating any carbohydrates. Or there are those of you out there saying, no, everyone should be a vegan. That's the best diet. The reality of it is that if we're looking at metabolic health, both of these extremes can be problematic. I know people who have decided to become vegan and wind up just eating a ton of ultra processed foods and develop metabolic dysfunction. I also know that in the carnivore camp, as much as it seems appealing to just eat meat all the time, there is no long-term data suggesting that that is a good option for metabolic state. And one of the concerns is that you're not getting fiber, you're not getting polyphenols, you're not feeding your microbiome. This doesn't mean to say that you can't do a carnivore or a very low carbohydrate diet successfully, but I would just say, in terms of the research we have right now, not only is there liability in terms of not having long-term data on carnivore diet and many health outcomes, but there are data suggesting that more red meat consumption is linked to worse metabolic health. In particular, what seems to be the case is more processed red meat is correlated with higher rates of metabolic dysfunction. Now, I know many of you out there may say, oh, but wait, X, Y, or Z. This is just what the data seems to be indicating, that if you're looking at the foods that are best correlated with good metabolic health, it's not going to be high consumption of red meat, and especially not high consumption of processed red meat. Other things I've already mentioned: decrease added sugar, nix the sugary beverages, and reduce refined carbohydrates. What about healthy gut and hormonal signaling, which largely comes from this connection between the gut and the brain? So again, whole grains, fiber, probiotics, so yogurt, kimchi, sauerkraut. If you're going to eat probiotics, which are foods that contain live bacteria, make sure that those foods don't have a ton of added sugar. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, oh, well, I'm drinking kombucha because it's good with the probiotics. And then you look at the back of the bottle and it has 40 grams of added sugar. So be cautious of that. But probiotic foods, good idea. Nuts, seeds, berries, leafy greens, healthy fats, minimize added sugar. And if you'd like to learn more about this, we did a webinar specific to this connection between the gut, brain, and the immune system. So if you'd like to look for that on the Big Bold Health channel, you can learn more about that. It's pretty interesting stuff. Other things, immunometabolism. So when we talk about immunometabolism, again, this interaction between the immune system and our metabolic state, some considerations here would be to consume more polyphenols. These are nutrients found in plant-based foods. They give plant-based foods their color, and it seems to be that consumption of polyphenols is linked to better immune metabolic integration. Other things here, omega-3 fats. So eating more foods which are rich in omega-3 fats may help to support immunometabolism. And then one other topic that I'll bring up here that I haven't touched on yet is reduction in alcohol consumption. Now, again, another contentious subject. There are some data suggesting that some small amount of alcohol may not be an issue. So even 1 to 2 drinks a day. But the reality of it is that the more that we learn about the pathways involved in alcohol consumption, the more that I would recommend, especially if you're consuming more than a couple of drinks a day, to really prioritize the cutting back and to consider working with a practitioner because, as you may have heard, alcohol is an addictive substance. As we're looking at muscle, so we've done videos on this. There's a link to it here if you'd like to learn more. Muscle is a contentious subject too because it tethers to protein, and everyone has an opinion on exactly how much protein to eat. Should the protein be from an animal source? Should it be from a plant-based source? Should it come from both of those? At least zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram a day is the recommendation for the baseline, and to increase it to up to about 2 grams per kilogram per day. Again, that's not going to generalize for everyone. Some people out there may not need that much. Some people who are trying to build muscle may need even more, but these are some baseline ideas in terms of total protein intake. We know that if you're going to supplement with a protein powder, both plant and animal-based sources seem to work pretty well. And then creatine monohydrate, there's some data suggesting that around 5 grams a day of creatine monohydrate may be beneficial to building and maintaining healthy muscle. Finally, omega-3s, even though they don't build muscle, seem to support healthy muscle. Okay, so we've covered a lot. We're already 50 minutes into this conversation, believe it or not. I want to wrap things up with exploring a little bit of the science that's coming out right now around metabolism. And if we have time, we'll get to a couple of questions. So, continuous blood sugar monitors, or CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, pros and cons. CGMs don't measure your blood sugar. They measure interstitial blood levels, or sorry, interstitial sugar levels, which are a surrogate for blood levels. So they kind of look at the glucose in between your cells, and that is a proxy for blood sugar. They're great for real-time information about understanding what your lifestyle is doing to your blood sugar. I mean, technically, if you're using medications, they're also very helpful too in understanding where your blood sugar is doing. So they were initially used in people with diabetes and now are being used with people who do not have diabetes. They are one of the best sources of biofeedback for your metabolic state. Some of the concerns and cons include the unnecessary stress that comes from being preoccupied with looking at your blood sugar, the cost, and the relative value. My perception on this is because so many people in the United States and around the world have some aspect of metabolic dysfunction, a CGM can be a very helpful way to get a sense as to what is happening in your body, to at least once or twice get that signal. So I've done this many times. I do think it's helpful, but again, that's a person by person type of risk benefit profile. Now, the new stuff. So, this is a study that is looking at how we can use eye scans to tell us about our metabolic health. So, what they did here is they look at blood vessels in the retina, and using this data, they can tell us about our fatty acid levels, our cholesterol levels, and our di and triglyceride levels. So, basically, this is a scan that tells you about your metabolic health by looking at the blood vessels in the back of your eye. Here's another study that just came out, and it was looking at how you can basically by examining sweat tell you about a person's blood sugar. So this is some very advanced technology, certainly not available for people in the real world yet, but introducing a sensor that looks at your sweat and by examining your sweat tells you about your blood sugar levels, which as somebody, as I said, has used a CGM, this takes it to the next level because you're not even needing to put on some sort of a small needle or device. And as I mentioned at the start, there's even some research now showing how we can use contact lenses to measure our blood sugar. So, a little bit of trivia about me is that I wear contact lenses. They don't do anything for me other than tell me, or other than help me to see. But it would be really cool if I would be able to get a little sensor so I could use the contact lenses to tell me about things like my blood pressure and my blood sugar, and maybe even my cortisol stress levels. And I think that's where the research is now going in terms of being able to provide metabolic insights in real time. So we're not just stuck basically getting a couple of labs each year and basically looking at triglycerides, A1C, and trying to use that as a surrogate for overall health. So, closing this out here, couple of ideas. Metabolic health is key to overall health. I hope I've stressed that idea enough to where you agree. Our metabolic health is in peril. The majority of us have at least one aspect of metabolic dysfunction as measured by the labs that I talked about at the start of this lecture. Lifestyle tools are part and parcel as it relates to interventions we have to consider for metabolic health. Lifestyle is largely the reason why metabolic health has gone so far downhill, and they are such a powerful tool to get us back on track. The immune metabolic link, something called immunometabolism, is key to understanding where things are going wrong, where opportunities come, and the future of metabolic health. And then finally, these new tools like a contact lens sensor or a sweat sensor should be available to the public in the next few years. Obviously, there's the consideration around the value, the cost, and the risks, but I do think the general gist of this being more access to our metabolic data in real time will be a major positive for all of us in being able to understand what is going on in our bodies and how we can improve those systems. All right, well, thanks so much for tuning in and learning about metabolism and why metabolism is so important to our health. If you'd like to keep learning about this topic, I would definitely say to subscribe to the Big Bold Health channel for lots more science. You can also subscribe to my channel at Dr. Austin Perlmutter for lots more specific to the brain connection to our health. If you've enjoyed this content, awesome. Love that you care about science, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks so much.